listening to She Speaks Talk Radio, where women's words are changing the world.
Welcome to the Mind Your Business show with me, your host, Tierra Womack, where we talk about finding balance between your life and your soul-led business, sharing the secrets of successful female entrepreneurs who are building wealth from the inside out, combining mindset and business strategies to create success on their terms. So hello, MYB family. Thank you for tuning into yet another episode, and I have a very special guest with me today. So get ready for a wonderful conversation. My guest, Tiffani Fest, is an award-winning actress, global activist, and TEDx speaker, using her personal story of survival and transformation to empower those in turning their greatest suffering into their greatest mission. So welcome, Tiffani.
Thank you so much for that exciting introduction. I appreciate that.
Yes, well, I'm so excited. I know that we've had a chance to chat briefly prior to the episode today. So, um, this message that you're spreading around, your suffering and your mission, it resonates so powerfully because here at the Mind Your Business show, and really She Speaks Talk Radio as a whole, we're a family of spiritual entrepreneurs. And we feel as though our businesses are the vessel to give back and serve in that way. Like our businesses are our missions.
Yes.
So on in that same wavelength, it's not just about the profit, but the impact on others as well. And you have this great quote: "When sleeping women wake, mountains move," which which I love. I'm like, yes. And the thing about it is, you've told me where the aspiration came from in turning your greatest suffering into your greatest gift. But I'd love for you to share a bit more about that story with the audience.
Absolutely. My TED Talk, if we start with that, I had never really publicly shared with the world that I am a survivor of sexual abuse, which for me was a childhood experience. It's usually someone close to you or in your family. This is not uncommon. And this was my grandfather. And it really shadowed, obviously, years of my life, then into my teenage years, and then becoming a woman and pursuing relationships. It really shrouded, right, a lot of my later experiences that then required a lot of therapy, which I still always say, like, I advocate for that. Anytime you've gone through something that is literally a trauma, don't deny yourself the gift of therapy and healing and transformation. But basically that suffering specifically really kind of came back to haunt me later. I sort of realized, okay, this is a real problem. Went and got the help that I really needed. But more importantly, to our spiritual kind of framework of this, I discovered Buddhism, which for myself became this key into seeing that actually the place where we suffer is the place where we have our greatest sense of purpose and mission. If we can transform that suffering into our mission to help other people who have suffered similarly. And another quote that I love and I use for that is Rumi, right? The poet who I love, who says, "The wound is where the light enters us."
Yes.
And that's always been a favorite quote. But for me, when I really started transmuting my own suffering as a sexual abuse survivor into this kind of thought of, well, how can I now transform that into a way to empower other women? Because 1 in 3 women experience, sexual violence, which is something you and I talked about when we first, talked about doing this podcast together. And I think that says so much about the fact that this is not uncommon. Why isn't it being spoken about more? There should be zero shame for women around this. This is not our fault in any way, shape, or form. It is a part of the patriarchy and systems that we are currently dismantling, right? So to speak up about it is so important. But for me, so that journey, to quickly go back to your question, it was, realizing in my own spiritual self and life that now I was ready to transform it into helping others. And then sort of deciding, well, how do I do that? And for me, that was a spiritual journey as well, which was that I sat down to chant the morning of the large earthquake in Nepal. And did not know that earthquake was going to happen as I was chanting. And I was chanting about like, where can I go and be of service in the world to women and children? And the earthquake hit as I was chanting. I got up from my Gohanzen, which is the altar that I chant at, and realized, oh, that's the universe telling me this is where I should go. And with, no training, no experience at all, I just went online and started Googling, literally volunteering Nepal women and children.
Right.
And I was so struck by the headlines that struck me the most around this earthquake were these headlines about women in rural villages who were pregnant, who have now lost everything. Their husbands have been, dead under the rubble, and they're giving birth out in the fields and having to push forward, right, for their children. And I was like, women are always, to me, the champions and the real like victors. Like, men don't have that experience. These are women carrying living beings in them going, I can't give up.
Yeah.
Wow. There is no choice. And so I went, and that was my first experience of sort of giving back to women. Was I ended up having this magical journey of spending about a month in a rural village in Nepal, in a village that had never seen Westerners. I mean, it was that remote, barefoot, no cars. They hike up mountains and they herd their goats and they have their rice fields. And we were helping to rebuild primary schools so that kids could go back to education, especially the young girls who, of course, were then being stuck at home, cooking and helping mom, right? And then that eventually led me to continue to go back every year to sort of seek out service, which eventually led me to New Light India, which is the largest nonprofit in the red light districts of Kolkata, which rehabilitates women and girls out of second generation prostitution. And it was that organization that when I hit, I realized that was my purpose, that I too have experienced sexual violence as these women and their daughters are. And this is where I need to be of service. And this is where I feel complete.
Wow. I mean, I have chills all over my body just listening to that story. And, how, again, you led with service. And I mean, it's so powerful on so many different levels. And this whole thought around, alchemizing someone's suffering into their mission and purpose, which I know is a strong point for you, for those who've listened into episodes of the Mind Your Business show, then you know that I am a 2-time survivor of narcissistically abusive relationships. And so for me, it took some time to really correlate my childhood sexual abuse with attracting those types of emotionally abusive characters, right? But going through, and I honestly don't think I've ever spoken about my childhood sexual abuse until right now.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for, creating this safe space as well with what you do. But I know that there's a correlation, but again, there's so much shame around all of it, all forms of abuse, whether it is sexual or mental, physical, emotional. And so just thank you so much for your courage in doing this. And again, I just feel like it still stems from this place of service. Like even with you sharing your talks and with you going to India, it's really profound and powerful.
Thank you. Well, and what you just said, if I may, strikes me as well, because I came from abuse starting at a young age, like you. And so that led me down a path of some destructive relationships as well. And I think what you just said is so important, because generally once you've been a quote victim of some sort of sexual violence, it then permeates the types of relationships you attract, because that's what you've now established as the norm.
Yep. That's it.
Right? So I'm with you in that, like, it isn't a one and done situation, right? Unfortunately, abuse begets more abuse. But then, like you, it just became about, for me, the older I got and the more I could look back and examine those patterns, that for me, that real breakthrough moment is what you just said, is really being able to transmute it, alchemize it into a gift and a mission and service. And I wish that was talked about more, right? Like, I think that's what led me to write my TED Talk during 2020, during lockdown. I wrote it alone in my apartment. And I just realized, in looking back at, what I had done with my life and with my activism, that that's exactly what I was doing.
Yeah.
And that I wanted to share with other women in particular that that that's the power of what that suffering can be, right? As opposed to just having it be this place where we, of course, experienced a suffering and dealt with shame and dealt with having to overcome and dealt with having to like build new healthy types of relationships in our love lives and in all our, relationships, especially if, I don't want to assume that everyone on this podcast is gay, straight, everything in between, right? But whoever that love partner is, you end up attracting abuse if you don't sort of do the work. But I just felt like that missing piece that even for me in therapy wasn't shared was this idea that's so spiritual of, well, how can I now make this my gift? My light to help others. And as much as I love therapy, one of the things I say in my TED Talk is that therapy was amazing. And I recommend it to get through the healing aspects that are needed and necessary. But the step further, which is turning that suffering into a source of mission, was not given to me there. And that was key for me.
Yeah, no, I, realize that it was my mission with my coaching to turn that suffering or that experience, I should say, of dealing with those two narcissists into a coaching platform for women who were rebuilding after. So, that's essentially where the Brave Way was even built out of, as you mentioned, alchemizing that experience or those experiences into a gift for these women to say, okay, someone else has been there, but they're also focusing on the rebuild. It's like, for me, I feel like it's almost a stamp of honor, and I hope no one's offended by that who has been with the narcissist. But for me, it was a stamp of honor, because I feel as though narcissists, they only break into mansions, they don't break into poorhouses, right? So it's something very special about you as a person, anyhow, right? But especially if you have this relationship with a narcissist, it's because they saw something very special in you that they were seeking to fulfill or fill their own ego. And then you also touched on something that was so powerful, and in the fact of, you quickly use the word victim, but I know that you talk a lot about value as a survivor. So if we can touch on that, I think that's really important, because I've never prescribed to this victim mentality, especially with the narcissistic abuse. It's like, listen, we've been through that experience. I'm not taking anything away from that. We have that mutual, capacity and understanding, but now what? Like, now what do you do with that experience, right?
So, and we agreed on that too. I think that where victim can be really invaluable to us as survivors is that I also believe that word stems from the patriarchal system in which we live. Because if you can continue to call us a victim, we're certainly not empowered. We're certainly not leaders. We're victims of this thing. And then that perpetuates the cycle of the shame and the silence. So I'm with you that, like, while I totally agree that in the height of the abusive relationships I was in, especially starting with that grandfather experience, I was a victim of his abuse for sure. But I am not a victim today. And to continue to prescribe me as a victim is to keep me down, right? And I really do believe that's part of just the patriarchal cultural system, that like that language inadvertently devalues us as we then claim our power. And so you and I were talking about, a big thing for me when I launched my TED Talk was creating this new word. And for me, it became female survivor leadership. And I just was like, that's what I'm going to champion, because otherwise I knew what was going to happen is people were going to keep saying, oh, I listened to your TED Talk about how you were a victim. You were a victim of sexual abuse. And these words that I understand, it's just been culturally embedded in us. So I was like,
and they say, I am too.
Yes, right? And I am too. Or I've had a lot of men, I will say this, and I am not at all a man hater. I think there are men working to dismantle these systems with us, and there needs to be. But there is still, right, this larger context. And I've had men, as opposed to, the title of my talk being turning your suffering into your mission, they come to me and say, oh, that must have been so hard for you to share. I'm so sorry that happened to you. And I literally stop them and say, I wouldn't be sharing if I was still a victim.
Yes.
So don't worry about that. I said I shared so I could empower people to take that suffering and make it their mission in the world. So, you're missing I don't need any sympathy, any sort of downtrodden eyes. Like, I don't need it in any way. And so it's been really interesting to also in that way dismantle those conversations, right?
I love that. And it's so empowering because I've never felt a victim of narc abuse or sexual abuse. Again, though those moments in experiences, like you said, you can come from and look at it and examine it from that capacity of whatever a victim lens looks like for you. But for me, it was always like, okay, now what do I do? Do I use that experience as an excuse to live in a way that isn't in my full capacity? Or do I use those experiences to catapult me into never having to go through that again? You also touched on what we thought was normal, right? So normal behavior, normal relationships. And I realized a long time ago that it wasn't about healthy and unhealthy. It was just normal, and those relationships ended up being for me unhealthy, but I still thought they were normal. So when you talk about the abusive patterns, it's really like the awareness from those experiences and how you can use those really, to me, for your success in other areas of your life in the future.
Right.
And I just think that's so empowering.
Yeah. And I will say this because, if there are women listening who are not at this point yet, right, that do still feel powerless or victimized, I do want to say, like, for me, I went through years of that. And I want to acknowledge that can be part of some people's healing.
Yep, absolutely.
But like for me, I spent some years struggling with just feeling like a victim of this abuse that had disempowered me, that was feeding negative relationships. And like I had that cycle, right, running, and I had that story running. And I guess I would just want to say to those women, though, that like, there's another side to that, right?
Yes, it is.
It's not that we're saying what you're feeling now doesn't exist, because
and it's not valid.
It's valid. I actually think there's going to be usually a moment of that deep recognition of yourself as the victim and feeling that pain, right? Acknowledging it's real. But I'm with you in that, gosh, the most empowering thing you'll be able to do to move away from it is to turn it into your superpower.
Yeah.
Because now you have the firsthand knowledge and wisdom to share with other women. And since it's 1 in 3, you're not alone. So you can be there to like you're doing with your work and your platforms and your shows, to elevate these women to like, let's rise up together, because this is not something we need to be ashamed about. We can turn this into a source of purpose.
Yeah, I always say the tide raises all boats, and the awareness, the education, acting in service, and going back to your point, I also in many areas of my life looked at my past experiences from a victim lens. But I think sometimes that's needed so that you can see and know what the difference is when you can shift out of that as you become more empowered in your self-worth, in your confidence, and those that journey, that part of your journey. So
yes, absolutely.
So yeah, now you touched on this aspect of female survivor leadership, but I love for you, because again, this community, we are a community and a family of female entrepreneurs, soul-led female entrepreneurs. So this whole concept of female survivor leadership, please tell me about it. It's fascinating.
Thank you. For me, especially when I've done a lot of service the last 6 years in India, really finding sort of my calling, my voice, my purpose out of my suffering. And when I gave the TED talk, sort of realized, okay, this is the next step in me, sort of as you guys are talking as entrepreneurs, as a cause entrepreneur, which is a term I also use for myself. And so my cause became, I said, okay, well, what is my why? What is this cause? And I just immediately was like, it's absolutely female survivor leadership. And this idea that how can we champion women who have survived sexual violence and put them not as the stories to organizations or human rights organizations or companies. They should be the leaders of those organizations. Like, that is our master's degree in in that experience, right?
Mhm.
And so it was something I started noticing for myself, for instance, as an activist, is I totally understand that, I don't have the degree in, social rights, human activism, sociology, anthropology, whatever you want to say.
Mhm.
And that used to sort of make me feel like I needed to take a back seat to the quote experts
Mhm.
in that field. And then I realized, through my experience and my service, that I have the experience and the knowledge
Equivalent.
that's equivalent.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So I think that I really sort of, again, right, going back to owning our power, realized I need to own that I am a leader in this area.
Mhm.
And if I can't own it, how am I going to tell other women, that I'm championing female survivor leadership? So
Yeah.
it was a really big realization for me after my TED talk that, like, oh, I also have to stand in this power. Like, I'm not just talking about that I've turned my suffering into my mission and that I'm an ambassador for this nonprofit in the red light district, which is amazing. And I'm going to continue to do that. But what else am I? Oh, I am a survivor leader.
Mhm. Yes, survivor leader. I love that. There's so much power in that. Wow. Survivor leader.
So,
Female survivor leadership. I love that.
yeah. And I started as a volunteer, as we just talked about. And again, I think service, volunteerism, and philanthropy is so important. But, it's kind of that step of like, okay, but then once I've had 6 years of field experience and written a TED talk, maybe I'm not a volunteer anymore. Maybe I am a survivor leader.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
I lead, right?
Yeah.
And leading being service too, right? It doesn't mean it transforms it to ego, and that now by leadership, I mean that I'm no longer,
Of service.
equal in service, right?
Mhm.
It's like, no, I still believe wholeheartedly though that good leadership is led in service, right? I mean,
Yes.
look at any great activists that we love, throughout history. They
Mhm.
led through service.
Mhm.
They led through rising up with others. And
Yeah.
so, but still claiming that word, right? Claiming survivor leadership does something for me internally that shifts the narrative.
Mhm.
And so if it can do that for me, I want it to do it for other women, right? We're not victims, we're survivors and we're
Leaders.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I have said quite often that I have a PhD
Mm.
in narcissistic abuse. You know what I mean? It's like you could not, me experiencing that not once, but having the gift of twice.
Yeah.
That is my PhD. I see it's a PhD in the School of
Right.
Hard Knocks. So,
That's right.
you
Exactly.
know,
Yeah.
but also I think it's important to think about that for women as entrepreneurs, because we do have a lot of experiences that we negate, that we don't give ourselves grace that we've gone through. And then somehow we create this mindset and this story around where it doesn't qualify us to step into these leadership roles or create the businesses that we really desire. And I feel like the women-led businesses of the world, they are coming from such a nurturing standpoint, whether they are service-based, product-based. It is there to serve the customer in magnificent ways that I just don't feel like is equivalent with male or, masculine energy within that space of entrepreneurship. So I love every aspect of that. And it leads me, touching on mindset, it leads me to my next question for you. What would you say is the number one mindset block in conversations you've had with women when they are thinking about turning their suffering into a gift? And then maybe one quick way that you can give the shift out of that.
Yeah. That's a great question. Honestly, I feel like if anything, the block that I hear a lot is someone thinking, well, that their suffering is still something that they're ashamed of, that they're not sharing.
Yeah.
And so, right. So usually I find that when someone's coming to me about my talk, they're sort of like, wow, you really shared that. And so I encourage them, I say, you sharing your deepest vulnerability will be your highest courage. Everything after that's easy. So I think often, I mean, this will sound simple, but I think that we forget that our place of what we think is our weakness, which is usually something we've suffered, that we're feeling shameful or feel unworthy around. Shouting that to the rooftops is what's going to break you free. And the
That is
minute you
it.
do that, every other wall that you've put up sort of starts crumbling, and you realize like I'm standing in my truth, which means I'm standing in my power, which means, you know, it's this other thing that I always believe, which is vulnerability is what courage is. You know, going back to the patriarchy of what we thought before courage looked like was violence, maybe aggression, maybe with masochismo energy. But we're all learning, you know, from people like Brene Brown to also, you know, men who are realizing this, that actually vulnerability is the ultimate courage. And so that is the key to actually unlocking your superpower, I think.
I love it.
Yeah, not what we're all doing, right? We still kind of hide away that piece of us because we think we've been taught that that's where we're weak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's such the source of shame and guilt and all the other things. But I realized like the first time I said I was, you know, I'm a survivor of narcissistic abuse. The first time I was like, oh, and then the second time it was like, yes. And then the third time it was like, okay, so this is who I am, you know? And so I find like that also has helped me to shift out of and feel okay using it as like my flag. Like it's not something that I'm going to allow myself to feel like a victim about any longer. So I love that you just touched on that. And you know, for those women that are listening to really sit and think about those areas where you are feeling the shame and guilt, right, about your life's journey. And I've always said that the awareness, like sometimes just being aware of where you're feeling that is very powerful. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, my pleasure.
So now we move into the mindset portion of minding your business. And I ask my guests a few questions. These are more so rapid fire questions. And I just, you know, the audience seems to really enjoy them, and I enjoy them as well. So the first question is, as someone who has won awards as an actress and stepped on TEDx stages, what is the one limiting belief that you've been surprised to experience at this level of success that you're dealing with? And then what's one technique or thing you do to shift out of that limiting belief?
Wow. Okay. Quick fire. Don't think too hard.
Yep.
Because that is a beautiful question. I would say the limiting belief I still face and keeps coming up, especially as I step into wanting to speak more at women's conferences and around the world. And I got this, you know, top speaking agency now, is really realizing I still have this sense in me of I'm not worthy.
Yep.
I'm not worthy to be there. Or what I like to say, who do I think I am?
Yep.
This. And so then you're suddenly, I'm lying, right? I'm not good enough for this thing. And so what I do now, because like you said, what really shifts is that you become more aware of these thoughts, right? Before it would be like, I wouldn't be able to step outside of that thought and see it as a thought because you're living it.
Yep.
And now I go like, oh, wow, look at these crazy thoughts I'm having of unworthiness. That isn't me. That is my old shadow self still calling out, you know, from this other side of my like old ways of being. Wait a second. You're not good enough. You're
How dare you?
Yeah. How dare you?
Mine says, how dare you?
Oh, it's so true. Yeah. And see, mine goes, who do you think you are? You're not a big shot.
Yeah.
Who do you think you are? You're just a girl from Texas and a small family with no money and abuse. Oh, you think you're going to stand on these stages now and you got this big speaking agent? Well, she's going to eventually see right through you that you're just not it.
Yes.
Yeah. And I would say a silly thing that I do to overcome that, and it's something I've learned through my spiritual practice, is to love her. I think what we do is we get mad at that thought. You know, our first instinct is to more be like, again, like tuck that down. And that's really scary. And why am I thinking like that? And I really try to see that as my smaller, scared little girl, right, who went through all that suffering. And I light a candle, I take a bath, I give myself a hug. I say, oh, this part of me needs love and nurturing.
Yes, I love all of that.
You know, need is to be now abused again by me going, how dare you tell me I'm not worth it? And I'm going to stuff you back into that hole where you came out of. It's like, she clearly needs some love.
Yeah, no, and that's so important. I do similar exercises with my clients where it is to think that thought.
Yeah.
And then say, okay, but I'm okay, because those thoughts are only coming up to protect you, to keep you safe, right?
Yeah.
So I love that. So
that safe usually means small.
Yep.
Right.
Usually.
Self-safe, it's usually that our smaller self, right? Because we're expanding, we're growing what we think is possible. Says like, no, stay over here and stay small with me.
Yeah.
Because I feel safe.
Yeah. No, it's so true. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Here at the show, I love to really touch on those limiting beliefs and mindset blocks that successful women are touching, so that we don't have to feel like we're suffering in silence with those thoughts of imposter syndrome and everything else. And so my next rapid fire question for you is, who is inspiring you right now?
Oh, wow. Well, I think I just said her. So Brene Brown is a big one for me.
Okay.
Especially as I was, delivering my own TED Talk and had watched so much of hers. And when I said vulnerability is the ultimate courage, that's a direct quote from Brene Brown, if you guys are followers. Because, that her TED Talk started, people don't realize, as a tiny talk. She gave it at a small TEDx conference, I want to say in Texas, which is also where I'm from. And it blew up. It wasn't what it is now, right? She just did this small talk in front of 500 women, and then it changed the trajectory of her life, a year later. So I would say Brene Brown. I'm also reading, so funny that you're saying it. I just went to her book signing and she was incredible. I don't know if I say her last name properly, Elizabeth Niameyaro.
Okay.
So she just wrote a book I recommend all women, especially women entrepreneurs. I would say it's so profoundly moving, called I Am a Girl from Africa. And I just got to meet her. So she went from literally a small village in Zimbabwe, almost starving to death during a drought. And a UN ambassador came over and gave her a cup of porridge at the age of 6, as she was literally laying there dying of starvation. And so from that moment, she planted a seed in her head that I'm going to grow up to be one of these UN ambassador people, because I want to help other people suffering, and I want to help my people and my country. And her book is this amazing story of like coming from a village of nothing to somehow getting herself to London, getting an education, and literally walking herself into like UN headquarters and being shunned away, and her being like, no, I'm supposed to do this.
Wow.
And now she is a senior advisor for UN, and she started the He for She movement. If you guys are not familiar with He for She, it's an initiative where she says for gender equality, we need men fighting these battles with us, because as women, we've been carrying this torch. Where's the men who are saying, you're right, we were wrong.
Yes.
Transform this. And so I just went to her book signing, and I'm reading her book, and I'm halfway through, and I'm just floored. So that's
so if you can, number one, He for She, I love that. What can you please repeat the title again?
So the book is called I Am a Girl from Africa. Very easy. And I feel terrible if I'm butchering her last name. She's Elizabeth Niameyaro, I believe.
Okay. Well, for those listening, we love some good books in here. So I'm going to grab a copy of that, because it's always like, it's the true stories. It's real characters. These are not fictional characters. And they can always inspire us in some way. And so thank you for sharing that. And then the last rapid fire is, what's the best advice you've ever received, whether it be a quote or just a piece of advice?
Wow. Oh my gosh. I'm trying to be rapid fire and I'm failing miserably. Best advice I ever received. Gosh. Honestly, okay, I'm going to go with this, even though it's going to sound real woo-woo and spiritual, because I don't.
Oh, we love woo-woo. No, we love woo-woo in here. Yeah. We're woo-woo family in here.
Yeah, perfect. Because I thought, I want to say it came out of my own ichinen, which in Buddhism is your own highest state. It was through my chanting, and I really feel like, the best advice I got, and I'm about to cry, was when my spirit told me, just go out there and give in the world, because you're meant to do this.
Yeah.
And I just took that leap to Nepal, and I had nothing, I had no experience. And I'm just so glad I listened to that inner voice that said, get out there in the world. This is it.
Yeah, so your best advice was from your divine self, the divine
Yeah.
aspect of yourself. I love that. Oh my goodness.
Thank you.
Well, Tiffani, it has been beyond a pleasure.
Well,
The listeners can't see me, but I'm like literally holding my hands because I just feel so expansive from this conversation and all the light you've shared with us. So thank you for that. And please let us know what's the best way to contact you for future speaking engagements, opportunities, and how the MYB family can stay in touch with you.
oh, thank you so much. Yeah, of course, I was going to say, I would love women and men listeners to take a look at my TED Talk if you can. The easiest way to find that is on my website, which is just TiffaniFestSpeaks.com. Tiffani with an I, last name Fest, like the word festival. So TiffaniFestSpeaks.com has the direct link to the YouTube TEDx video. It also has a place where you can click on my Instagram. My Instagram is also just my full name, which is Tiffani Brook Fest. But all of that can really be found on my website. So that would be the easiest way. And I would be delighted to meet any of you. Please reach out and say hi. And yes, by all means, if there's any kind of event that I could come and support, I would be more than happy to.
Yes, I that your TEDx was really groundbreaking for me, and the way you took the spin on the suffering and turning that into your gift. So if anyone is looking to be inspired today while you're driving home, listening after you finish with this episode, just pull that up, and it's relatively short, and it's really just really profound. So I want to now give the takeaway for those listening in. So your takeaway today is to ask yourself, where have you not given yourself grace in your suffering, that by sharing your story, you can be a gift to someone that is needing to hear your journey? So just think about that. Don't put too much wait on the answer. The first thing that pops up is like, oh, well, I have this memory or this thought, and it can even be current. Tiffani and I shared from our childhood, but it could be an adult experience that you're just not giving yourself grace, that someone else can really, you can change their life by sharing that story. So that's your takeaway for today. Please keep sending those to me. I read each and every one. So whether you want to send that via DM, you can find me on Instagram at The Brave Way, or via email, hi@thebravewaytribe.com. Thank you, Tiffani. And for those tuned in today, if you've enjoyed the show, please share with someone or three so we can continue to share the love and spread the value. And if you're looking for support in shifting your money mindset and your self-worth into really desiring wealth and success for yourself as a female entrepreneur in ways that maybe you haven't seen been done before, and removing those money blocks, or even to find more white space on your calendar, please reach out to me. Let's have a chat. Again, DM on Instagram at The Brave Way, or via email, hi@thebravewaytribe.com. Thank you again, Tiffani.
Thank you so much. This is such a gift. Thank you so much.
Yes, I appreciate you. And MYB family, keep your head in the game. Remember that you deserve success, time, freedom, and balance in your life and your business. And ask yourself today, how am I minding my business? Talk soon, everyone.